The late summer heat baked the dust of the auction yard into a fine, choking powder. It settled on weathered hats and weary shoulders, a universal blanket of grit and resignation. Elias Thorne felt it in his throat, a familiar taste of endings. He stood at the back, a ghost leaning against a splintered rail, a place he had occupied in the town's consciousness for a decade. He was not here to buy, only to watch the slow, grinding machinery of other men's lives. It was a penance of a kind, observing the commerce of things he no longer had a stake in. The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly drone, rattling off pedigrees and promises. Cattle came and went, their bewildered eyes reflecting the harsh sun. Then the rhythm broke. The heavy gate groaned open, and a hush fell over the cynical crowd, a silence so abrupt it felt like a held breath. They led the horse into the ring. He was a great black beast, more shadow than animal, his coat scarred and dull beneath the dust. His name, the auctioneer announced with a sigh, was Goliath. The name was not a boast, but a warning. His eyes were wild, white-rimmed pools of terror and fury. He lunged at the rails, scattering the nearest bidders, his hooves striking the packed earth with the force of hammers. The story was already legend. 12 seasoned Cowboys had tried to break him, and 12 had failed, leaving a trail of broken bones and shattered pride. He was deemed unrideable, a dangerous liability. But it was not the horse that seized the air from Elias's lungs. It was the boy. He followed the great horse into the ring, small and thin as a willow switch. His clothes were little more than rags, his feet bare and caked with the same grime that covered the pen. His hair was a tangled mat of sun-bleached brown, and his face was a mask of careful blankness, his eyes fixed on the horse. He did not seem to be leading the animal so much as connected to it by an invisible thread. While the handlers kept their distance with long poles, the boy walked close, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the horse's trembling flank. And when he did, the massive creature would still, just for a moment, the frantic tremor in its muscles easing under that slight touch. The crowd began to murmur. Laughter, sharp and cruel, pricked the heavy air. "Selling the stray, too," a man called out, and a wave of chuckles followed. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson with a face like a worn saddle, ignored them. "The horse is from the old Miller Ranch foreclosure," he explained, his voice strained. "The boy, he was just there, refuses to leave the animal's side. State services have been called." A man in a clean, cream-colored suit stepped forward. His name was Vance, a developer who bought land the way other men bought beer. He appraised Goliath not with a horseman's eye, but with a collector's arrogance. He saw the powerful bloodline beneath the scars. "I'll take the horse," Vance said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The boy can be handled by the authorities. Start the bidding." Henderson nodded, but as his men moved to separate them, the boy did something that silenced the yard once more. He did not cry out or struggle. He simply moved, placing his small body between the men and the horse. Goliath, who had been a storm of violent energy, went perfectly still behind him, his great head lowered over the boy's shoulder in a gesture of absolute, fearsome protection. The standoff was clear. To get the horse, you had to go through the child. The crowd grew uneasy. This was no longer sport. It was something raw and unsettling. Vance scoffed, impatient. 500 for the beast. Someone get that child out of there before he's killed. It was then that Elias moved. He pushed himself off the rail, his joints protesting. Each step forward felt like pulling his feet from thick mud, a decade of inertia fighting him. He walked to the edge of the ring, his shadow falling long and thin over the dust. He did not look at Vance, or the auctioneer, or the crowd. His eyes were on the boy, and on the horse that guarded him. He saw the shared trauma, the fierce, silent pact between two broken things. In that moment, the dust and the heat and the 10 years of hollow silence fell away. He saw a different arena, smelled the cloying sweetness of blood and dirt, felt the phantom weight of a small hand that was never to be held. An instinct, buried so deep he thought it had died, clawed its way to the surface. "I'll bid," Elias said. His voice was rough, rusted from disuse. Henderson turned, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Elias, you don't want this trouble." 1,000, Elias stated, his gaze unwavering. A ripple of shock went through the onlookers. Elias Thorne hadn't bid on anything in 10 years, not since the accident. He barely had enough to keep his neglected ranch from being swallowed by the weeds. Vance turned slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the frayed shirt, the worn-out boots. "Thorn, I thought you were dead," he said, the words dripping with condescension. 2003. Elias countered immediately, the word costing him more than the money. Vance's smirk faltered. This was not about the horse anymore. It was about an old ghost refusing to lie down. He studied Elias's face, that stoic mask of grief, and saw something he did not understand. A flicker of resolve. He raised his hand. 5,000. Cash, the finality of it hung in the air. It was a sum he knew Elias could not match. Silence descended again. Elias stood motionless. He had a few $100s to his name. The compassionate look on Henderson's face was almost worse than Vance's sneer. Elias reached into the deep pocket of his worn denim jacket. His fingers closed around the only thing of value he had left. He pulled it out. It was a rodeo belt buckle, a champion's buckle, heavy and ornate, made of silver and gold. It was tarnished with age and neglect, but the engraving was still clear: National Champion. Elias Thorn. It was the last prize he had ever won. The prize he was wearing the night his world had ended. He held it up. "This," he said, his voice cracking just once. "And my name. My credit is still good in this county." Henderson stared at the buckle, then at Sheriff Brody, who stood watching from the shade of the main office. Brody had seen it all. He had been there the night of the accident. He had pulled Elias from the wreckage. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all the assurance Henderson needed. "The bid stands," Henderson announced, his voice firm. 5,000 in credit, secured by the Thorn name. "Do I hear 6? Vance's face was a thundercloud of fury and wounded pride. He was being challenged, not by money, but by something else. By history, by reputation, by a ghost with nothing left to lose. He looked from the defiant boy to the immovable horse, and then to the broken man who was willing to wager his own legend on them. With a disgusted flick of his wrist, Vance turned and walked away. "Sold," Henderson said quietly into the stunned silence. To Elias Thorn. The boy looked up then, his blank expression shifting for the first time. His eyes, wide and searching, met Elias's across the dusty pen. In their depths, Elias saw not gratitude, but a profound and unsettling flicker of recognition. The journey back to the ranch was a silent procession. Elias drove his old, rattling truck, the engine complaining with every mile. Behind him, the boy walked, leading Goliath. He had refused to let the horse be trailered, and Elias had not forced the issue. He understood, in a way he could not articulate, that their connection was too fragile for steel walls. Silence was the only crop the ranch had grown in a decade. The fences sagged, the barn door hung on one hinge, and the house stood dark and weathered, its windows like vacant eyes. Weeds choked what was once a garden his wife, Lena, had tended with gentle hands. The place was a monument to his grief, preserved in dust and neglect. He expected the boy to be afraid, or at least hesitant. But the child walked onto the property, as if coming home. He led Goliath not to the dilapidated stable, but to the one paddock with a stretch of fence that was still sound, where a lone, gnarled oak tree offered shade. The horse, which had been tense the entire walk, lowered its head and began to graze, calm for the first time since Elias had laid eyes on it. The boy did not speak. He moved with a quiet economy, finding a leaky trough and an old bucket, filling it from the spigot by the house. He worked as if he had done these chores 1,000 times. Elias watched from the porch, a stranger in his own life. The boy was a mirror, reflecting a past he had tried to bury. The way he moved, the fierce loyalty to the animal, the profound and lonely silence. It all stirred a painful ache in Elias's chest. Later that afternoon, a familiar truck rumbled up the long, untended drive. It was Sarah, the town veterinarian. Her face was etched with a quiet strength that came from mending broken things, both animal and human. She carried a bag of feed and 2 bottles of cold water. "Henderson called me," she said, her voice soft. She didn't ask questions, not directly. She just looked from Elias to the boy, who had settled under the oak tree, his back resting against Goliath's sturdy leg. The horse stood over him like a sentinel. "He's thin," I know, Elias said. And the horse is half wild. I know that too. Sarah nodded, accepting the terse replies. She had known Elias before he had retreated into himself. She was one of the few who still remembered the man who smiled. Vance is not going to let this go, Elias. He doesn't like to lose. Elias just stared out at the paddock. The boy had fallen asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Goliath had not moved an inch. He reminds me of someone, Elias said, the words so quiet they were almost carried away by the wind. It was the most he had confided in anyone in years. Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, sad understanding. I know he does, Elias. She left the feed by the porch and drove away, leaving him alone with his ghosts, one old and two new. Days bled into a week. A routine, unspoken and unwritten, began to form. Elias would leave food on the porch, sandwiches, fruit, a glass of milk. The boy would take it, eat under the oak tree, and share pieces of the apple with Goliath. He never came inside the house. He slept in the hay of the open-sided shed, the black horse standing guard at the entrance. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Elias was watching from the darkened kitchen window. He saw the boy run a hand down Goliath's powerful neck, tracing a line over the muscle and scars. The horse responded with a low nicker, a sound of pure contentment. The boy then rested his forehead against the animal's cheek. It was a gesture of such intimate trust, such profound belonging, that it struck Elias like a physical blow. The memory was sudden and sharp. Lena, 8 months pregnant, standing in this very same paddock. She had been resting her forehead against their old mare, whispering secrets of the baby to come, a soft smile on her face. The image was so vivid, he could almost smell her perfume on the dry evening air. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white, the dam of his carefully constructed numbness cracking. This boy, this horse, they were not just a reminder of his loss. It felt like they were a piece of it, an echo he could not explain. Sheriff Brody came by the next day. He was a man whose gentle demeanor hit a core of unyielding iron. He didn't come with sirens or official papers, just a thermos of coffee and a heavy heart. He and Elias sat on the porch steps, the way they had 1,000 times in a better life. People are talking, Elias, Brody said, pouring 2 cups of coffee into tin mugs. About the boy. About you. Vance is making noise in the county seat, claiming the boy is a ward of the state and you're harboring a runaway. Elias took the mug. The warmth did not reach his hands. He's not a runaway. How do you know? Brody asked gently. He hasn't said a word. He doesn't have to, Elias replied. He's not running from something. He's holding on to something. He gestured with his chin toward the paddock. To him, Brody followed his gaze. The boy was meticulously brushing Goliath's coat with a frayed brush he must have found in the barn. The horse's brand, Brody said, changing the subject. It's an old one. From the Miller place, like Henderson said. But it's been altered. Faintly. Hard to see unless you're looking for it. This caught Elias's attention. He looked at the sheriff. Altered. Beneath the Miller's M, there's another mark. A simple C. For Castillo, Brody said. Maria Castillo. She worked as a ranch hand all over this state. A real drifter. A hell of a horsewoman, from what I hear. She fell off the map about 6 months ago. The Miller Ranch was her last known address. Castillo. The name meant nothing to Elias. And yet, it felt like a key turning in a lock he didn't know existed. The need to understand became a quiet obsession, a purpose that began to push back against the fog of his grief. He started with the barn. He had not truly been inside it for 10 years. The air was thick with the ghosts of hay and leather, a smell that was both comforting and agonizing. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the roof. Old tack hung from the walls, draped in cobwebs, brittle with age. He started going through things methodically, not knowing what he was looking for. He ran his hands over his old rodeo saddle, the leather dry and cracked. He opened trunks filled with ropes and gear, the tools of a life he had abandoned. The work was mindless, physical. It kept the memories at bay, even as he was surrounded by them. Sarah came to help. She didn't speak of Vance or the town's gossip. She simply worked alongside him, her presence a quiet balm. If this Maria Castillo was a drifter, she mused, wiping dust from an old bridle, she would have traveled light. Her whole life might have been in a saddlebag. The word snagged in his mind. Saddlebag. He stopped, his eyes landing on a small, battered leather bag tucked away in the corner, half buried under a pile of old blankets. It wasn't his. It was smaller, more delicate. It was Lena's. She used to carry it when they traveled for the rodeo circuit, filled with books and snacks and first aid supplies. He had packed it away with all her other things, unable to look at it, unable to throw it away. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The leather was supple but worn. He unbuckled the main flap. Inside were things he expected: a worn paperback, a small sewing kit, a roll of gauze. But his fingers brushed against something hard in the lining. A seam, thicker than the rest. He followed it with his fingertips and found a small, hidden slit, closed with a single, tiny button. He had never known it was there. With fumbling fingers, he worked the button free and reached inside. He pulled out a small, flat object wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a photograph. Faded and creased, but the image was clear. It was his Lena, her smile as bright as he remembered it. She stood with her arm around another woman, a woman with the same dark hair and determined eyes. This other woman was holding a baby, a tiny infant wrapped in a blue blanket. Both women were looking at the camera with an expression of fierce, joyful pride. Elias's breath hitched. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in Lena's familiar, looping script, were a few simple words. My sister, Maria, and her son, Leo. God watch over them. May they find peace. The world tilted on its axis. Sister. Lena had never spoken of a sister. She had always said she was an orphan, that her family was gone. Leo. The name struck him with the force of a physical impact. He looked out the barn door, toward the paddock where the silent boy was sitting with the giant horse. Leo. The past was not a memory. It was here, sleeping in his hay shed, caring for his mother's horse. The boy was not just a mirror of his lost son. He was family. He was his nephew. The weight of the revelation was crushing, a strange mix of agony and a sudden, sharp flicker of hope. He was not alone. He had not been alone all this time. The dust had not yet settled on this new reality when the sleek, black SUV rolled up his drive. It moved with a silent, predatory grace, utterly alien in this landscape of decay and resilience. Mr. Vance stepped out, his suit immaculate, his face a mask of polite, reptilian calm. He was not alone. Sheriff Brody was with him, his expression grim, and two men in crisp uniforms stood by a second vehicle marked Child Protective Services. The past had arrived. Thorne, Vance said, his voice smooth as polished stone. This has gone on long enough. He produced a sheaf of papers from a leather briefcase. This is a court-verified bill of sale for the horse known as Goliath. The original owner, a Maria Castillo, used the animal as collateral on a loan she defaulted on. The Miller Bank owned him legally, and I bought him from their assets. My claim is ironclad. Elias said nothing. His mind was reeling, trying to connect the pieces. Maria, desperate for money, had signed away her horse, the one thing her son had left of her. Furthermore, Vance continued, his eyes cold, the boy. His name is Leo Castillo. He's a ward of the state. His mother is deceased. You are illegally harboring a minor. These gentlemen are here to take him into protective custody. The words were a hammer blow. Elias looked at Brody, a question in his eyes. The sheriff shook his head slightly, a gesture of helplessness. My hands are tied, Elias. He has the paperwork. It's legal. The two uniformed men began to walk toward the paddock. The boy, Leo, saw them coming. He scrambled to his feet, his small face pale with a terror that was no longer blank, but sharp and immediate. He stood in front of Goliath, his arms spread wide, a tiny, defiant scarecrow. No, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step forward, placing himself between Vance's men and the path to the paddock. Vance chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Don't be a fool, Thorne. You're a broken-down relic living in a ruin. A judge will take one look at this place and your history and declare you unfit. You have nothing. No legal standing, no money, no power. It's over. From behind him, the sound of another engine made them all turn. It was Sarah's truck, kicking up a plume of dust as it came to a stop beside Elias's porch. She got out, her face set with determination. She stood beside Elias, a small, defiant group of two. You're wrong, Vance, she said, her voice clear and steady. He's not alone. The gathering of allies was small, but their presence changed the air. It was no longer one man against the world. It was a stand. Brody shifted his weight, his discomfort palpable. He was a man caught between the law he was sworn to uphold and the justice he knew in his gut. The sky, which had been a clear, harsh blue all day, began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, moving in with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves and carrying the scent of rain and ozone. A storm was coming. The confrontation was set. A psychological battle on the cracked earth of Elias Thorne's neglected life. Vance, with his legal papers and his cold authority, stood on one side. On the other, a broken man, a compassionate veterinarian, and a silent boy guarding a traumatized horse. "This is your last chance, Thorne," Vance said, his voice rising to be heard over the wind. "Step aside." Elias did not move. He could feel the weight of the photograph in his pocket, a tangible link to the boy he now knew as his own blood. He was no longer just protecting a stray. He was protecting family. The CPS workers hesitated, looking from Elias's unyielding form to the terrified child and the massive, agitated horse behind him. Goliath sensed the tension. His ears were pinned back, his nostrils flared, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Do your job," Vance snapped at the men. One of the men took a hesitant step forward, his hand outstretched. "Son," he said softly, "it's okay. We're here to help you." The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, kicking up puffs of dust where they landed. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Then, Leo did something no one expected. He turned his back on the men. He looked directly at Elias, his eyes wide and pleading. It was a look that crossed the space between them, a silent question, a desperate act of faith. And in that moment, Elias understood. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. What happened next was not the violent explosion everyone feared. It was an act of pure, breathtaking grace. Leo reached up, grabbed a handful of Goliath's tangled mane, and swung himself onto the horse's bare back. He did it with a fluid ease that spoke of 1,000 secret rides in lonely fields. Goliath did not buck. He did not rear. The great, unridable beast stood steady as a rock beneath the boy's weight. Leo settled on his back, his small frame perfectly balanced. He was not a rider dominating a mount. He and the horse were one entity, a single being of shared trust and wild spirit. He was not controlling the horse. He was communicating with it. A collective gasp went through the small audience. Vance's face contorted in disbelief. This was not possible. The beast that had broken 12 men was as placid as a lamb under the command of a slip of a boy. Leo urged Goliath forward, not with a kick, but with a slight shift of his weight. The horse took a single, deliberate step, then another, walking calmly past the stunned CPS workers. He stopped directly in front of Elias. Leo looked down from his perch, his face no longer terrified, but filled with a quiet, solemn power. The storm broke then, the rain coming down in a torrent, washing the dust from the air, from the trees, from their faces. Leo opened his mouth. A sound came out, hoarse and unused, but clear in the sudden downpour. Elias. The name, his name, spoken for the first time by the boy, shattered the last of Elias's defenses. It was not just a name. It was an anointing, a claim, a choice. At that exact moment, Sheriff Brody's radio crackled to life. A voice from dispatch cut through the static and the sound of the rain. "Sheriff, got that information you wanted. The brand on that horse, the C for Castillo?" Forensics on the bill of sale Vance filed came back. "The signature from Maria Castillo is a forgery. A damn good one, but a forgery. The original loan was paid off 2 days before she died. The horse is not his. It belongs to the estate. It belongs to the boy." Every eye turned to Vance. The color drained from his face. His mask of control crumbled, revealing the petty, grasping man beneath. The legal documents in his hand were now just worthless paper, soaked and limp in the rain. His power, built on lies and intimidation, had evaporated into the storm. Brody stepped forward, his face hard as granite. He didn't need to say a word. The truth, raw and undeniable, hung in the air between them. The two CPS workers, seeing the fraud exposed, backed away toward their vehicle, wanting no part of what was to come. Vance stood alone, stripped of his authority, drenched by the storm that mirrored the ruin of his plans. He threw the papers to the ground, turned without a word, and retreated to his pristine SUV, leaving a stain of humiliation on the muddy ground. The black vehicle drove away, its tires spitting mud. And then, there was only the sound of the rain. A clean, washing sound. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. The sky lightened, and a watery afternoon sun broke through the clouds, steaming the moisture from the ground. The world smelled new, washed clean of dust and deceit. Leo slid down from Goliath's back and stood before Elias, dripping and shivering slightly, but his eyes were clear. He looked up at the man who had wagered a memory to save him. Elias knelt, the wet ground soaking through the knee of his jeans. He did not feel it. He looked at his nephew, at the face that held echoes of Lena, and felt a decade of ice melting inside his chest. He reached out a trembling hand and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from the boy's forehead. He did not say, "I'm your uncle." He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say any of the thousand things that were clogging his throat. Instead, a single tear, hot and heavy, escaped his eye and tracked a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was the first tear he had shed in 10 years. It was a surrender, a release of the grief he had held clenched in his fist for so long. It was an acknowledgement of the profound, painful, beautiful gift that stood before him. Sarah and Brody watched from a respectful distance. No words were needed. They were witnessing not an ending, but a quiet, fragile beginning. Months passed. The sun of a new spring warmed the land. The change on the Thorn Ranch was slow but steady. A new section of fence stood straight and true, its wood still pale against the weathered gray of the old posts. The barn door was rehung, and the weeds had been cleared from Lena's garden, the dark earth turned over and waiting. The silence of the place had changed, too. It was no longer the hollow silence of absence, but the peaceful quiet of purpose. It was broken now and then by the sound of a hammer, or the low nicker of a contented horse, or the sound of a boy's voice, still quiet, but growing stronger every day. Elias had found a new purpose. It was not the grand, explosive purpose of the rodeo ring, but something quieter and far more profound. It was in the mending of a fence, the teaching of a knot, the sharing of a meal on the porch steps. He was healing the ranch, and in doing so, he was healing himself. His ranch was becoming a sanctuary. Word had spread, not through gossip, but through the quiet channels of men like Brody and women like Sarah. He had started taking in other horses, animals deemed too broken or too difficult. He and Leo worked with them, their methods silent and patient, built on the foundation of trust they had forged with Goliath. The three of them, Elias, Leo, and Sarah, who was now a constant, welcome presence, had formed a new kind of family, one not born of tradition, but forged in a crucible of loss and defiance. They were bound by shared experience and a quiet, unspoken understanding. One late afternoon, Elias stood with Leo in the main paddock. The sun was low, casting long shadows, turning the dust kicked up by the horses into a golden haze. Elias was showing the boy how to check a hoof, his large, scarred hands gentle as he guided Leo's smaller ones. "You feel for the heat," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "It tells you things before you can see them." Leo nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration, his touch on the horse's leg sure and confident. Goliath stood patiently, his great head lowered, a silent partner in the lesson. This was their life now, a slow, quiet journey, a path forward paved with small moments of grace. The past was not gone, but it no longer held him captive. It was a part of him, a landscape he now shared with the boy who was its living legacy. Elias looked up, across the healing land, toward the house where a light now burned in the kitchen window. He felt the warmth of the setting sun on his face. It was not an ending. It was not a cure. It was the first day of a new season.